digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. We have some special guest hosts who will be taking over the hosting of the show.
digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello everyone, welcome to Digital Jam Sessions. My name is Mookie and
my name is Jeremy.
And we are covering for the lovely Tanya Laird, and we are going to be focusing this Digital Jam session on the latest Immerse UK report, which came out in May 2018. The exact date is unknown to all humans, but you can find it online. I'm going to kick things off just by explaining a little bit about what we're going to be covering. But again, my name is Mookie Callahan. I run Mookie International, and I'm an executive digital producer covering all things cross-media, immersive content, cross-platforms in the music and broadcasting spaces.
And my name is Jeremy Dalton, and I lead the VRAR team at PwC, helping companies across all industries understand and quantify the benefits of virtual reality and augmented reality technology.
Now that's a sexy job, ladies and gentlemen, if I've ever heard one before. So cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really hoping that if you're a big fan of the Digital Jam session, so you're familiar with how these things work. We normally had a couple guests booked in, but they couldn't make it today, coming from the Knowledge Transfer Network and Immerse UK and Innovate UK. They couldn't make it, so we're going to try to do a part 2 later on with a bigger dissection of what this report is about. So Jeremy and I thought today that we would give you a little bit of a dummy's guide layman term overview and a little bit of highlights and what things to look forward. So if you haven't read it, this gives you a good kind of brochure, if you will, a good taster of what's happening. And if you have read it, maybe it'll make things a little bit more clear or angry or happy or sad.
And caveat, it's our own personal view on the report.
Yes, disclaimer.
And hopefully it will be further clarified and expanded upon in the next session that we do.
Yes, exactly. So thanks for joining us. But what is this report about? So, I mean, Jeremy, what can you explain it in your words? What is this Immerse Innovate UK report about?
Yeah, so from reading the report, the objective of this was to try and understand better the UK immersive landscape or VRAR landscape. It was to try and understand how many companies we've got in the UK, to get their thoughts on barriers and success factors to growing their company in the industry, to provide some solid data that all sorts of stakeholders from government to VRAR companies can use now and in the future as part of their business case or to as backup for any products or services they're building in the immersive industry. So there's a lot of interesting interviews in the report. There's a lot of interesting statistics and data and charts and graphs. And
it is chartastic, let's face it.
And over the next 15 minutes or so, Mookie and I will have a look through a few of them, a select few, and try and draw out our own analyses from them.
Yeah, so we got like an overview, the history of this immersive space, which doesn't start from 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, as we know, with a lot of the kind of production teams and academics and scientists that we've worked with before and know that it has been around for a really, really long time. There's a history of immersive. If you turn to us on page 20, listeners, on page 20 of this report, there is a little bit of a graph explaining how this sector has grown so much, and it's starting from the 30s and 40s. It's starting from 1940s to be precise. And Jeremy and I looked at this as kind of phase 1, 2, and 3, with phase 1 covering from the 40s probably to the 90s. So you've got 50 years of R&D and experimenting. Like, how did it start from like the 40s and what was happening during this time?
So basically the chart that we're seeing here, as Mookie explained, does outline the history of virtual reality and augmented reality technology and shows you that in the first phase, which was around the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s mark, we see little pockets of activity when it comes to immersive companies. And actually, perhaps it's worth me mentioning now, before I expand and start using these terms left, right, and center, there are what's called specialist immersive companies and participant immersive companies. Now, in the report, they define immersive participant companies as companies that generate up to 50% of their turnover from immersive products and services, and specialist companies that obtain their turnover, over 50% of their turnover is relating to immersive products. So just to put that definition out there before we then go into the analysis, in that phase one now, from the 40s to 80s, let's say, you see little pockets of activity when it comes to specialist companies, a little bit more when it comes to participant companies. And that's understandable, as you had a lot of academic explorations in the space. You had stuff like Morton Heilig's Sensorama, the mechanical
abacuses, kind of all kinds of things.
It was so old. It was back in those days, exactly. Phase two now is starting from the 80s and going up to the late 2000s. This is where on the chart you can start to see the beginning of growth in the industry. You've got
seismograph is heating up here.
Exactly. Yeah. You've got a lot of up and down activity when it comes to participants as they start to explore the market and try out and test new things. And then the specialist companies showing some growth activity starting in the mid 90s. Now, if anyone remembers back in those days, I don't know.
Back in the day.
Mookie, were you around in the late 80s?
I was, in fact, yes.
What was your memory of virtual reality and augmented reality products back then?
Zero. I was playing Pac-Man, probably. That was my immersiveness.
That's probably a good thing.
but in a way, that's, virtual and augmented reality, in the Midwest America was non-existent. I saw real cornfields in front of me. Actually, Pac-Man.
and I'd say it's an advantage that you didn't get to experience virtual reality back in those days, because for those of you who went on the various virtual reality arcades and experiences back then when it was getting really hyped and pushed in the consumer market, it was, well, in my personal opinion, again, not a very pleasant experience, given that it was generally very expensive machinery, it was very bulky, heavy headsets, thick cabling coming out of it, and ultimately the experience made a lot of people sick.
What's your experience from the 80s?
Well, it was in the early 90s.
Were you born yet? Right. Hang on a second.
There's a clear generational divide here, folks.
But not represented on this graph.
But in fact, we see that as a positive thing. It's all about diversity, right?
It is. It really is. So we've got phase one, which is research and kind of the beginning of everything, and we know that it existed, and we know that it was being used in various forms of, not thinking in the entertainment world or arcades, but it was starting to overlap into science and medicine and training and things like that. And then, in the 80s and 90s, things started to develop to more public-facing and consumer, just like these worlds do. What that happens with, devices were chunkier back then, and you had your phones connected to a cord and plugging into the car, and that's how it was working. And then around the mid-90s, which things started to actually be more and more public-facing and outward, but consumers still weren't using it enough. And then you probably start to have, I guess, your spikes start to happen around 2005. So what was happening there then?
So then in phase three, on this chart, you start to see a slight drop in the number of participant companies, but a massive spike when it comes to specialist companies. And my interpretation of that is that we're seeing a lot of companies who were previously playing in the space, participating in it, but now there is far more confidence about dedicating a company to immersive technologies.
And I think with the specialist participants, the report is referencing, automotive and design enterprises, drone tech developers, things like that. By all means, those companies weren't dropping off. They were kind of continuing on like a little bit of a steady hum, where with the spike that we're talking about is the red spike here. That's more companies starting from scratch that were coming from either the engineering or the tech backgrounds, or like in my case visual production and television production and digital production, and that it's a natural morphing into this type of formats.
And the interesting thing is, I'm just going to jump quickly just because we're on the subject. On page 23...
What page would that be? Oh, yes.
On page 23, there is actually a figure which talks about the percentage of specialist immersive companies working in different markets. So as Mookie mentioned, automotive is represented there. defense is represented there, manufacturing is represented, engineering and so on.
Yeah.
But they, in fact, are in the middle to the lower end of the chart. And what is really taking the lion's share of the percentages in this chart is media companies. They've split it in different ways, but the next biggest one is relating to a use case around training. And we know that training is one of the big use cases of virtual reality and potentially augmented reality technology as well. So that makes sense. And then, of course, we have games coming up, as well as education, which is very interesting, because you hear a lot about the education space, but the statistics generally point to education being a significant, but not a sort of top 5% significant revenue generator for the immersive
So
industry.
education meaning teachers providing their classes with headsets, maybe there's people with learning difficulties or dyslexia or things like that, where
And that may be the
you're
reason.
able to use it, or
Exactly. It may be because that is the definition of education here, and we're
hearing
talking about
impaired, things like that. Yeah.
exactly, and we're talking about percentages of companies. We're not talking about revenue here, which is why perhaps there's that disparate contrast between other statistics.
Yeah. So I think in this report, again, we're trying to bring a little bit of layman's terms to this, so it can be easily digestible, like the specialist versus the participants, so and also just other caveats. All of these stats, and they're coming from the NTM and some of the guys that help put these reports together. So these are done through polls and surveys that they conducted through their own kind of research, and Nesta, which we know is representing the big man and women.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to know how this all, a little bit of the history and where it's come about. I mean,
I'll also mention, Mookie, on that point, you were talking about the MTM surveys that were done as part of this report.
Mm-hmm.
They also commissioned a startup called Glass to do what's referred to as a machine learning analysis of the text on on the internet, basically. So the Glass data included web metrics like the size of the websites it was analyzing, the number of inwards and outward links, the text itself, the top 50 words that were mentioned in the whole body of text. A lot of machine learning. Exactly. So all of that analysis got brought in, which feeds into these stats that are in this report.
So a fantastic irony here that a lot of AI, I believe, was used within this machine learning to produce an immersive report, which is cool. I think it's also, kind of blending into the growth is coming from companies, smaller companies, larger companies, finding the success. With that comes the barriers in any type of research, development, production, the way that these things are going. And so I think it's on page 34. There's a really nifty Tetris-y Candy Fruit style, Candy Crush. I've never played Candy Crush, believe it. I might be the only human being never.
I'm not going to admit to having played it.
I never played it. I played Crossy Road a lot. Have you played Crossy Road?
I think I tried Flappy Bird.
Oh, Flappy Bird. That's Flappy Bird. Anyway, we digress. That's for the gaming chat. So there's a Tetris-y style heat map. So seeing the graphs grow and things become more popular, and one of the reasons why this report was made is to prove that it's on the up and this industry is growing. Where are these successes coming from? What are the barriers that have been around? And I think, overcoming the barriers, you get to certain levels of the success with the barriers. And I think some of the barriers that they're mentioning here are like the skill shortages, educational things, like not enough unis taking part in it. Like, what's your interpretation of this, the lower Tetris graph?
Yeah, so the lower one, which is just concentrating on barriers, as you mentioned, Mookie, the key aspect across all regions, including London, appears to be the worry about skills shortages in the industry. And I suppose that's understandable when there's not a lot of universities at the moment that are dedicating courses to virtual reality and augmented reality, but we're starting to see that come through.
And that's one of the questions I'll have for Immerse, Innovate, KTN, whoever is able to pop by this part 2 of this. Like, where do you go from there? What are the unis offering, like, specific immersive content degrees? Like, we know there's tech-specific schools in London, like Ravensbourne, and we know UCL and Royal Holloway, and like a lot more unis are like focusing on these kind of productions, but versus the level of successes, like, so the barriers here versus the successes. So
So when it comes to the successes now, it's a far more colourful Tetris heat map. And the two key drivers of success are infrastructure and technology expertise, which is quite interesting.
Right. Does that seem not oxymoron-y, but is that...
When I first thought about it, I think, initially when it comes to your mind at first glance, it seems like a contradiction, but that might be one for KTN and Immerse UK to decipher. I think our definition of technology expertise is perhaps different to the skills shortage. Maybe by technology expertise they mean the current expertise that they have, whereas skill shortages relates to when they're trying to bring someone from outside right now and they don't have that skill in the company, they face a difficulty there.
Yeah, I think that's mentioned in the word section of this report. We love looking at the pretty pictures, don't we? But I think it does say, like, once, and we love the pictures. When companies, like, I think we're still in a transformation phase of getting those skill sets in place and getting the training done. And you can't do the training without some of the expertise. And it's those chicken, egg, eggy chicken, squawk, squawk, don't step on the egg, right? And then once the expertise becomes a little bit more stable, they're able to bring in more talent and mentor them and educate them. And that's mentioned in the report too. Like, where are these levels of success? How do you achieve the success?
Yeah.
And these ecosystems, and that is like training and mentoring. And, they do even mention the thousands of meetup groups that are honing in on this area, whether that is AR, VR, mixed reality, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean,
and a final interesting point on this local drivers of success heat map is that if you look at it on a regional basis, the findings are almost similar across the different regions, but for some reason Northern Ireland really sticks out as having attributed interest in all of the areas, in fact, compared to relatively to the rest of the regions.
It is like completely smashing the rest of the UK, isn't it?
It's basically saying that everything is extremely important, from infrastructure to public finance to the ecosystem to private finance to local customers. They're all extremely important to the Northern Ireland population from a immersive perspective.
We maybe that's a Game of Thrones. We blame Game of Thrones for the success of Northern Ireland's interest and the importance of it.
Could be a lot of excitement over there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that was going through my mind, my interpretation is, like, with London being such a hub and, the hot spots of regions, which I think are on another page where it kind of does give a graph of, like, what are these regional locations that are kind of thriving in it, like mentioned Coventry, London, Bristol, it is becoming up and down, offices being moved up and down the UK. But I mean, is it a disadvantage of living and working in London because it is such a saturated market? Like, what do you think? What are you finding with that?
So about 38% of the companies within this data exercise were found to be located in London. And that offers a distinct advantage for other immersive companies that are located here, because obviously you have all of those different stakeholders and companies, and that community, basically, you have it all around you in the London area. And that's very important from a knowledge perspective. That's important from a community feel perspective, from a knowledge sharing perspective, all of this sort of stuff. But then, of course, there are disadvantages to living in London as well, in terms of the higher cost. And as we all know, cash, especially at companies starting out at the very initial stages, is of the utmost importance, really. So there are pros and cons, really, to being based in the regions and being based in London.
I suppose so. In a nutshell, regionally, you may be dealing with smaller teams and more precise expertise, and the funding could be, or the talent pools and the level of turnover and of product and creativity is more concentrated. And then in London you have a little bit more access. But then, I just mentioned funding there. So when companies, anyone is reading this, I suppose, like, if we're talking about, from my point of view, from like a production point of view, a small company point of view, I work with lots of different crews and lots of big name brands and broadcasters and record labels and things like that. Thinking of it from like a production perspective, and people that I've even spoken to who have read this report, are applying for the funding, but they automatically feel that they are in a minority living in London. So like how do you reckon the issue of this report will kind of either inspire people to try to go for it, or like the barriers of that, like, because you do need some funding to help your success graphs grow and those charts grow. What do you reckon this will kind of help big dogs versus the little dogs? And
so I think it's
and
important.
Maybe wrapping in with Horizon 2020, which is mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's a report of this nature is extremely important for both of those stakeholder groups, because it's being commissioned by a UK governmental entity, implying that there is a desire to try and understand the market better, and the results of the report and the results outside this report point to the UK being a very vibrant and dynamic and significant market in the immersive industry. But now we have additional credentials basically that allow large companies and small companies to use as part of their business case when they're seeking investment, when they're trying to build products in the immersive space. And also, ultimately, I think it can only help both of those companies.
Because it feels like it's the beginning now. There's a new road being paved ahead, especially with a report like this. And people like the government, which is one person, the government, and big brands and big companies being curious, how can they grow in this space? Because it's not going to go away. It is, the tech is getting improved. The audiences are more curious about it. What I liked about this report, it does cover, things like the haptics and the eye track and, that kind of
the adjacent
minority report type of thing. Exactly. Yeah. And it's important to remember that, besides if you're automotive or human resources or a big film studio to a research company or, publishing and things like that, education, it can be applied to all this kind of stuff. And we mentioned Horizon 2020. So you can kind of summarize that in one sentence, can you? Horizon 2020, I think it's page 21 has a little bit of on page 21, viewers, listeners.
Basically,
it shows,
Horizon 2020 is an EU program that provides a funding pot for companies that meet its specific criteria. I don't have the criteria off the top of my head at the moment, but it's something we can also discuss with the KTN and Immerse UK.
Yeah, that's part two. Sorry, I didn't mean to say. But I think it's when you an average, small company looking at this is looking for some hope and thinking that there are going to be people looking out for them, and what is that next step? And maybe there's a way, when we chat with the Immerse guys next, that there is a pocket for the underdogs that might not have angel or venture or round C, that round one funding, seed funding, things like that there is something for them. And if that is, the barter training and the kind of the collaborations.
Exactly. The key point to take away is that Horizon 2020 represents one potential pot of funding.
Yeah.
But there's also funding from Innovate UK. There's funding potentially from VCs and banks, although that's quite low in the immersive industry, and that's covered in the report as well. There's also non-financial funding pots that you can seek for support. Things like co-working spaces, things like accelerator programs, things like Creative XR from the Digital Catapult, the Augmented program also from the Digital Catapult, the ViveX.
Is that a shameless plug?
Shameless
Jeremy?
plug, because it connects to what I'll say at the end. But to be fair to them, Digital Catapult have been very involved in supporting the VR industry.
I agree.
And also you have ViveX now, who have decided to open up an accelerator in London.
At White City. I was at that launch actually, and it's so nice to actually see these larger companies showing that kind of initiative of, hey, you know what, we're here to find the innovation, we're here to find, to help you. But again, you do need to have some minimal viable product. You need to have some level of reason for people to invest. So it's important to kind of, if you are starting a business, you are starting a thing, to, have at least on a pencil and a piece of paper your 5-year, a little bit of a pipeline, a little bit of a business plan, because that's important too. But at the same time, it's good to go to these kind of meetups and experiment a bit. So we've covered quite a lot in this 52-page, very colorful, graph-led, information-led. So a little bit of the history, barriers, successes, regional funding, things like that. So what's summarizing this in a nutshell? So like, what's to come after this report from your point of view?
So I would hope that following this report and others which I'll mention, we will see a continued rise in the number of specialist and perhaps participant companies in the immersive space. I hope we see greater regional representation when it comes to immersive technologies. And I also hope that the reports that follow form part of this spearhead to grow the UK's VR/AR industry. And in fact, one particular report, which I'll shamelessly plug.
One particular report that PwC helped produce.
Exactly. And it was PwC in conjunction with the Digital Catapult, with thanks to Innovate UK, who commissioned it ultimately. This is about, the title of the report is Growing Your VR/AR Company in the UK, a Business and Legal Handbook. So it looks
nice and snappy, Jeremy.
Exactly. That's what we do as consultants, come up with snappy titles. But ultimately this report was to help UK VR/AR companies, as well as companies who are looking at doing anything in the VR/AR space, to give them a quick guide of reference to understanding the industry and understanding what they can do to quickly grow that product.
I look forward to reading that, actually. That seems like a nice progression from this. Somebody looking at that, they're like, now what's next? What do I do now?
Absolutely, and all of these reports will supplement each other as well. I mean, you have other ones that are coming out too, as well as where Digital Catapult have worked with the Opposable Group, for example, and TechSpark.
More Nesta action, creative tools.
The High Value Manufacturing Catapult.
And Opposable, very nice.
Yep. And all these reports are all around immersive content formats for future audiences, creative tools and workflows for immersive content creation. So ultimately, these will all really help together to grow the industry here in the UK.
Yeah, I think, and we did mention there were a couple bits and pieces on, the more the UK industry grows, the bigger there's potential for exports and, the collaborations with other countries, which we'll get into once we get these guys, once we get our friends over at KTN and Immerse and everybody, and kind of expand on that, because I'm also curious about, will crypto come into play? What will happen with Brexit and diversity and elements like that? So we'll cover all of that in the next time. And then as far as like in the format of the Digital Jam sessions, we do like to kind of make sure that we get in, what is going to be the next big thing to change, be that cultural or technological, to grow this immersive industry in the UK. Jeremy, starting with you.
So I think my big thing is more cultural than technological, and it relates to the different stakeholder groups we have in the immersive industry in the UK. So we have support and input from the UK government. We have companies that are building VR/AR products. We have the media, which is spreading the message about the technology. We have the public, some of whom haven't tried VR/AR technology at all yet. And all of these groups, I think, need to talk to each other a bit more: government, industry, academia, public media. And ultimately, when we have that conversation within all these pockets, I think that will help to really better understand the industry.
That sounds like an amazing immersive cultural group hug.
Absolutely.
With everything.
I'm all for group hugs.
I'm all for group hugs. So in juxtaposition, I'll represent the technical side of things, where I think the back end software, the production skills will grow. Well, what are the things that need to change? I think it is training, and it is getting more skill sets involved in the next gen. And if that's like both of us going to like somewhere like a Ravensbourne or Media Trust and talking to the next generation and bringing those skills, because I want to be hiring these guys one day, and then you want to be writing about what we make. So that's important. So I think that's a little bit of a wrap. So at the same time, we're going to give you guys our social handle so you can contact us at any time. You can be retweeting this. And if you do have any questions or comments about this report, wherever you are listening to this or seeing this on the socials, please write in the comments, because we are going to be doing a part 2 and picking up with our friends at Immerse and Innovate and KTN. And we really want to hear from you guys and see what's happening. And then at Digital Jam Limited, you can find me at Mookie Approved, mostly on Twitter and other random locations.
Yep, and I'll go for Twitter as well. You can find me on at Jeremy C. Dalton, and looking forward to chatting with you all.
Brilliant. And that's a wrap of Digital Jam Sessions.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk.
digitaljamsessions.com